This is Trench Diaries. Overlord. Utah Beach, Part 2. Gefreiter Stefan Heinwetz. I saw a shape appear in the air from an area of trees to one side, and from my experience in Italy I saw that this was an Allied hand grenade. It landed short and some distance from me. And although some debris hit me in the face and shoulder, it did not injure me badly. I immediately fired on the trees, and the trunks of these trees fragmented as the bullets struck. The range was only about 50 meters. I saw no response from there, but I did see movement from my left, near the farm buildings where the injured cattle were moving around. I thought that might be one of the cows, which were still mooing and thrashing their hooves in pain. However, I clearly saw a military helmet, green, with netting, and I recognized from the enemy troops I had seen in Italy that this was an American soldier. He was in long grass, probably trying to outflank me. I shot towards him, and I saw the helmet lift up in the air and spin over. After that, I saw a man's hands moving, in the manner as if he was clutching himself, and I fired again. I knew that I was being surrounded, and my heart was beating very heavily, but at the same time my eyesight seemed very acute and I was watching carefully for the next threat to my position. One problem was that my ears were still ringing from the bombardment and I could hear very little. Between the dunes, I could see vessels on the sea itself, being mostly green or gray colored craft of a type I had not seen before. I understood much later that this was the day of the largest seaborne invasion in history or the biggest military operation ever mounted. But that is actually all I saw of the landing itself. Just that glimpse between the dunes, with a lot of boats on the water. I think this often happens to basic foot soldiers in a war. They are in historic battles or campaigns, but their view is limited to the fields around them. Suddenly, because I could not hear the approach, a man appeared next to me, tumbling through the air beside me. He sprawled on the ground beside the gun, and I saw he was shot repeatedly through the chest. He was a German soldier from the strong house whom I recognized. He was carrying a rifle. I looked around, and saw several more of our troops running towards me from the direction of the beach. One by one, they were all hit by bullets, knocking them down in moments. One man was hit horribly in the head, and he lost most of his skull. Another man was hit in the stomach and he writhed on the ground, thrashing his legs and vomiting. Two men threw themselves down next to me, and one was immediately hit in the neck and had his head partially severed. I fired a very long burst in an arc around the whole front of me, and this enabled the other man on the ground to get behind me, sheltered by the gun shield. He was a lieutenant, although I did not know him. Anyway, he had an MP-40 submachine gun, and I was reassured to have an officer with me. He shouted in my ear, and I could just understand. The strong house is lost. Bring the gun and leave the Tobruk. I said, you order me to leave the Tobruk? He said, we will take the man and go to the next bunkers. We will join the troops there. There was a further line of bunkers inland, about 2 kilometers south. I did not know what the situation might be there. It might actually be worse than this. However, more of our troops began to appear from the beach zone, and I fired off large amounts of MG bullets to cover them. Some were shot, but I also hit 3 Americans with Thompson guns whom I saw emerge from the trees, and they tumbled onto the ground. The lieutenant stood up, showing himself as a target, and no shots came. I was impressed at his courage. He shouted, now, we move, and this proved to be a good choice of moment. As we came level with the 3 dead Americans, one of them moved and seemed about to rise. He had a Thompson gun close to him. The lieutenant stooped down quickly and shot him in the head with his MP-40, then shot the other 2 men likewise. One of our own men took a Thompson gun and spare ammunition magazines from the bodies. I would not have done this. I knew from Italy that if a soldier, whether German or Allied, was captured with enemy souvenirs on him, then his treatment as a prisoner would be violent or even lethal. On the Eastern Front it was an immediate death sentence, apparently. But the Thompson guns were superb items, being famous as the gangster guns from the 1930s, and they were hard to resist. Armed in this way, we advanced down the earth track towards our inland bunkers. I struggled to keep up now with my limp, but I did my utmost. It was very warm, and I was very thirsty. My leg was becoming painful because of my limp. We stayed in the cover of the trees, because huge numbers of aircraft were passing overhead. The lieutenant gave me a drink from his water canteen, because I had left mine behind in the Tobruk. Because of the need to go up and down through the cupola, it was not possible to carry the regulation water bottle, gas mask case and haversack equipment. To my surprise, the lieutenant's water was mixed heavily with schnapps, and it was very refreshing. That lieutenant in many ways was a complete contradiction to my experiences with other officers before. I never knew his name. We came into a low area where the land was flooded as a defense. Our commanders had diverted the local river to disgorge partly onto this plain in order to deny its use as airborne landings or for troop advances from the coast. This floodwater was about 1 meter deep and covered about 2 square kilometers, and beyond that was higher ground where our second line of bunkers was positioned. There was a wooden walkway leading across the water, but this was bombed and burning. The only other way was to skirt around the whole flood area to reach the bunkers. At the side of the track, there was a FAMO-type half-track, the type without armor, parked under a stand of trees, and there was nobody present with it. Possibly the crew had deserted, or been killed away from the vehicle by the airborne troops. At any rate, this powerful machine was there for the taking, with the starting lever still working and a small amount of fuel. The officer ordered us into it, with the intention of driving it around the floodwater to the fortifications. We men bundled onto this vehicle, and one of the soldiers started it and began to drive. Of course, this was the worst thing we could have done, because the FAMO was very visible from the air. Although we drove under a long line of trees which partly shielded us, it was only a few seconds before a fighter plane came down to look at us. It came in from over the floods, and I believe it was a Mustang type, although it was moving so quickly that it was literally a blur in my vision. It fired its guns on us, and the tracer shot along the water, over the roadway and hit us in the engine and cab. I was sitting at the back of the vehicle, and I saw the bullets smash into the sides of the cab, tearing off all the metal body plates. With no armor, there was nothing to protect the driver, and he was thrown out of the vehicle onto the road. The half-track veered around, and we ran over the driver as he rolled in the roadway. Then the FAMO rolled down the small embankment into the floodwater. There was nothing to be done for the driver. His body was completely crushed open by the tracks of the FAMO. The engine was on fire, and this made our presence even more conspicuous from the air. I jumped off, with the officer and the remaining soldiers plus our weapons, and we continued on foot along this track beside the water. The plane returned a few seconds later and machine-gunned the vehicle again. Looking back, we saw it blow up completely as we ran on. We found there were other troops on this track, going in the same direction, and the officer grouped them together and ordered us to work as a team. We were now about 20 in number. Sometimes the planes fired on us, and at other times they simply flew along the road, firing at the empty pathway. They were at liberty to do as they pleased, with no Luftwaffe to challenge them at all. Several of our men were hit, and those that were struck were simply left by the path, as it was impossible to bring them with us. I remember that one man was hit in the abdomen by several bullets. His body was cut in half, I am sorry to say, and the rest of us could only step over the 2 pieces as we ran on. Towards the end we were fired on from ahead of us, killing one of our group. This proved to be another German Tobruk sighted near the bunker line. When this Tobruk gunner realized who we were, he waved us on towards the bunkers and called them to warn of our approach. My leg was making it almost impossible to run. Finally, we passed through barbed wire positions and slit trenches, and we came into the second line bunker zone itself. This was a series of concrete blockhouse structures, 3 of them about 100 meters apart, well camouflaged, on slightly rising ground, with a good field of fire over the roadway, the floods and over an area of marshy land which separated this area from the coastline. These forts had been bombed, and there were craters all around, but they were intact. There were many vehicles jumbled up around the approaches, half-tracks, Kugelwagons, motorcycles and horse carts. These bunker structures were what we called resistance points, and I saw that they were armed with 75mm anti-tank guns, which were on wheels inside the buildings, with their barrels projecting through the embrasures, and a variety of MG positions. This was a strong area to defend, as the approaches were lower lying, difficult to cross and had little concealment. I felt more confident here, and I was seen briefly by a medic who gave me a soldier's cocktail, which was a mix of morphine and amphetamine against the pain and exhaustion. I went into one of the bunkers, which had an anti-tank gun aimed out over the marshes. They were glad to see me with my MG-34. I positioned this on its bipod mount and then waited. The men who manned the bunker were questioning us new arrivals frantically. How many? Who are they? What weapons? Are there tanks? Flamethrowers? And so on. But what did we know, really? We knew there was a sizable force approaching, with tanks of some kind, and there were also American airborne troops in the area. In this blockhouse, people were jumpy, constantly calling out that they saw something, arguing with each other. The mood was nervous. A feldwebel came in and reprimanded us for our behavior, and we became more orderly under his command. This feldwebel told us that reinforcements were coming up from the south and east, and that we had only to hold this bunker line for a few hours before our panzers would arrive to push the attackers back to the beach and into the sea. This was an excellent little speech, and it rallied our nerves well, because we now knew that there were armored divisions dispersed to the south. I suddenly heard a call out for approaching aircraft. I peered up through the concrete slit, and saw a horizontal line of 3 aircraft descending on us over the marshes at great speed. These planes had very large radial engines, which from our recognition sessions I knew was distinctive of the Thunderbolt plane. I recall being surprised, because the planes appeared to be bare metal, the sun reflected very brightly off their surfaces. There was nothing that any one of us could do, although I and several others fired our MGs up in an attempt at flak defense. This was rushed and ineffective, because the Thunderbolts were simply too fast. The flak cannon fired, and I saw the 20mm cannon tracer fly up to seek the planes. The 20mm shells were very bright, and snaked slightly in the air. Some of these shells actually hit one of the planes in the wing, knocking pieces out. This plane lifted up and banked away, but the other 2 continued to descend, and they released bombs from under their wings as they approached us at probably 100 meters height. The bombs flew out almost horizontally from their wings, and the pilots lifted each wing in turn to release them. It is strange how the mind remembers such a detail, but in the heat of the moment, the senses are taking in all this information, and it is indelibly imprinted on the memory. The small, dark bombs, 2 from each plane, came tearing across the marshland and into our bunker line. The bombs slapped into the flat ground in front of us, and bounced up, tumbling over in their momentum. One bomb bounced straight past us and went between the bunkers, then another hit our roof and deflected off without exploding. It detonated somewhere behind us. From my slit aperture, I could see the blockhouse on our right. This was hit by at least one bomb, and it was covered in dust and smoke, but appeared to be standing. The Thunderbolt aircraft came down on us repeatedly. I think there were 6 or 8 waves of them in all. Our flak hit one of the planes in the early waves. I saw this aircraft lose its propeller and engine cowling, and then the cannon tracer pierced its wings. The plane exploded in a very long streak of fire, and did not lift out of its attack run. It raced straight down onto us and hit the ground to my left, where many of the vehicles were scattered. There were huge explosions from that side, which I could not see. The succeeding waves were not hit by flak, and I realized that our 20mm had stopped firing. The bombs kept coming at us, and I saw one of them skip across the ground and tumble into one of the slit trenches crammed with infantry. The explosion threw up many pieces of men, weapons and clothing, all mixed together in the shockwave. I gave up looking through the embrasure. All we could do was to crouch down under the embrasures and put our hands over our ears under our helmets to protect our eardrums. The bunker shook several times, and the explosion sent many chunks of shrapnel and debris hurtling through our concrete apertures, which ricocheted around the interior. One of the pack crewmen broke down, and began screaming. His comrades punched him to the ground and he lay sobbing there, while another man took his place.